Hello and welcome to the Product Opscast with Graham Reed and Antonia Landy. Antonia, how are you doing this afternoon?
I am very well. Thank you, Graham.
Fabulous. Today, we are joined by Tor Mitchell, CPO exec in residence at Balderton Capital and formerly VP of Product at Miro. Tor is also the organizer of Product Tank Oxford, which was revived early 2025, I believe, since the pandemic, which I was honoured to speak at a couple of months ago. Welcome, Tor. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Do please introduce yourself a little more.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me along. Great to see you both. Yeah, so I'm Tor. I've been in product for about 15 years. I've been in the tech space for about 30 years. I started out on the engineering side and moved into product back in late 2009, early 2010, while at Google. My formative years were sort of managing some of Google's more well-known developer products, including their Maps API, before returning to the UK in 2015 to join a equity crowdfunding startup called Crowdcube, who are actually a Balderton portfolio company. So that's how I first met Balderton Capital. And that was my first full leadership role. I joined as their first head of product, became their CPO shortly afterwards. And then, as you mentioned, my most recent full-time role was a VP of product role at Miro, initially in the UK, and then ultimately in Amsterdam, starting in early 2020, sort of pre-pandemic when they were a much smaller company. And then kind of going on that roller coaster through the pandemic and out the other side, kind of as the enterprise SaaS market started to contract in 2023. So I moved to Amsterdam for that role and then returned to the UK last summer. And as you say, joined Balderton as a coach and advisor on product to their portfolio. Turner, one of the larger European VC firms, exclusively focused on European founders. They have over 250 active companies in the portfolio, and their current funds total something like 1.4 billion pounds, I think. So sizable by European standards, and a very diverse portfolio. Mostly early stage Series A investments, but a few growth stage investments as well. So a lot of very different companies, but many of them struggling with sort of similar operational challenges.
You've certainly moved around kind of over the years, haven't you? Done UK, Europe, US. Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I've lived in the US twice. I've lived in Australia for 5 years with Google. I've lived in Amsterdam. I think that I just the sheer number of house moves that have been involved just don't bear thinking about. But it's suffice to say that yeah, I know the drill now. Although hopefully not doing too many more of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually, the yourself and the podcast actually have a nice connection in that one of our previous guests, Torsten Lowenberg, one of your team from Miro, was a former guest earlier part of this year, and was talking us through what he did in product ops over at Miro as well.
Yeah, Torsten's a good friend. Was actually this is sort of product initially when he first joined Miro. He was assigned to my stream, so he was my direct product counterpart. We worked very closely together. Would go out for dinner every few months just to sort of map out where things were on top of regular one-on-ones. One kind of slightly amusing coincidence is that, as you know, Torsten is from Germany. The literal translation of Torsten is Thor's stone, which is another way of saying Thor's hammer. So it all kind of worked out rather well.
Fantastic! What a great story. Thank you very much. Well, today we have a slightly different format of the show. We're going to be all learning from each other a little bit. We'll be asking and answering each other different questions. As much as Antonio and I want to learn about Tor's experience and his huge depth of experience as well in experiencing product ops and transformation, Tor's also here to learn just as much as well, I think, from us. So let's absolutely dive into it. Tor, do you want to kick us off with a little bit of your experience with product ops, and we can fire some questions from there?
Yeah, I'm sort of this structure came about after kind of we were chatting about potential opportunity for me to join you. And in all honesty, my experience of product ops is pretty much exclusively based on my experiences at Miro working with Torsten, which was a great introduction. But I would not claim to be an expert in the space. I can sort of represent what it's like as a product leader to work alongside like someone who's strong in that domain, and how that changed the nature of my role, because there was very much a before Torsten and then after Torsten experience. So that's potentially interesting. But I do think there are a lot of people in my position, sort of product leaders, who either haven't worked with product ops teams or have limited experience. And I thought it might be interesting to sort of represent them as an audience and sort of say, well, these are the things I would like to have known or would like to know going forward when I'm thinking about the value of introducing product ops as a function into the business, how to effectively work alongside sort of product ops people as a leader, what your expectations of leaders are, like what makes a good partnership, what makes a good team. And then, how like product ops can augment the leadership role and how you work well together without necessarily treading on each other's toes.
I
Wow.
love that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
We're in the hot seat.
Absolutely.
For
Yeah.
sure.
I mean, I think we could easily fill the hour without me having to do any talking at all. But I guess, I mean, I think it's good to start from like the fundamentals. And so, interestingly, and I don't know whether this is very common or maybe this is the way it's always done, but at Miro, the product ops function lived under a larger organizational unit called Product Excellence, and it sort of inspired my first question, really, which was like, when you think about like how you explain the value of the role and how you quantify the kind of the ROI of the role, like how do you quantify or how do you think about sort of operational excellence, like what that is, and how you translate that into the language of the business, I guess.
Antonia,
Do
do
you
you
want me
want
to start?
to? Yeah,
Yeah,
you go for it.
absolutely. I love this question. So in terms of ROI, I think there is a wider strategic question of, are we going into the direction of our organizational vision? Are we going that way? And then there are more tactical questions of, are we exhibiting the behaviors we believe are congruent with that wider strategic objective? And I think that's also why whenever I work with a new client, for example, my first question is, as a company, where do you want to be in 5 years? Right? Like, what do you want to be known for? Do you want to become experiment driven? Do you want to have data backing every single one of your decisions? Is actually engineering excellence the big thing that you're banking on to drive your organization forward? Is it innovation? Right? And then going from that big fluffy ideal, breaking it down into what behaviors, what skills, what capabilities are necessary to execute on that vision. And then very tactically, then the work becomes, how do we get us there? Right. So I think for me, the return on investment comes in that higher order, but it's also in actual business success, right? Because the whole idea of product operations as that strategic lever is that you empower the product teams to make better decisions, and that leads to better business outcomes. Right. So on the one hand, sure, we can measure, are we set up to run experiments, or how many of our experiments move the needle more than 1%, for example, or how many times do people actually engage with customers or speak to users. But I think more broadly, we do also need to take a look at the bottom line of the entire organization and think, are we shipping more meaningful features at the end of the day?
I mean, you've answered the whole question, I think, Antonia, there. And I know, and that's why I sort of let you answer that one first, because I know that's a real passion area for you. And Antonia quite often talks a lot about kind of that very strategic element, absolutely where her mindset is and her passions are. And I think totally right on that. A lot of the work that I've done, particularly over the past year, has been a lot more in the detail, a lot more on the tactical elements. So I quite often find myself being more a problem solver at times. Someone that is called upon to, go out and figure out how we fix this part of a particular process, or how the teams are operating, how the teams are communicating, how the teams are collaborating well, how are we doing our kind of planning. And that's not just within the product team. I think this has long been a weird problem with product operations, is that it's not just firstly product management. It usually always spans the entire kind of tech division in a typical SaaS environment, but quite often, touches upon other parts of the business as well, particularly where that business is very tech focused, where the tech teams, the product teams, what they deliver is a primary focus for the business. There's a lot of touch points upon the wider business as well about how are they interacting with what products are delivering, what they are planning, how is product interacting with them as well, and how do we smooth out those touch points so that actually the very small but very cumulative changes that we end up making turn into something that's quite big and successful, and really just then enables that engine that powers some of those big strategic moves that we want to do and make. Measuring's a whole topic in itself, and we've covered this so many different times with so many different people that have successfully tackled this as well. And it's certainly one that I think we can we can dive into a little bit more now. Just in terms of what is a good measurement for product ops as a whole. Antonia, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on that measuring piece. So let me hand over to you for a second.
Yeah, so measuring is interesting because I think for a long time in product ops, we were like, it's just intangible. You just can't measure it. It's transformation work. I actually think we're really doing ourselves a disservice. And again, like you can measure actions taken, right? You can measure change in behavior just like you would with any normal product. I think there are some implications in that, and I think we need to be specific about that, right? We assume that by getting people in front of customers more often, for example, they will build better products. To a certain extent, that's an assumption, right? But as an industry, I think we are agreeing that more interfacing is better than less interfacing. Again, and here's the difference between measuring and something like a performance review, right? Because I do think that for product operations, measuring throughput, measuring speed or velocity, and measuring even user adoption, like feature adoption, does make sense. I wouldn't necessarily say product ops is doing a bad job, right? If that doesn't immediately see kind of this hockey stick uptick, right? Like I think that the uptake is slightly slower, but I do think they're KPIs that are important for us to think about and look at so that we can better design what this kind of operating system in the company looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think it's important that the product, well, from my perspective, that the product ops function is seen as unlocking greater productivity and not as an excuse for leaders not to coach their teams, right?
Yes.
So, if I went to an organization and discovered that it was the product ops function that was really trying to drive best practices in product management and like in customer discovery and in, and in planning and things like that, I'd be thinking, well, that seems like a dereliction of duty of the product leadership to actually, be driving those kinds of behaviors through the organization. But if instead what I'm seeing is that the function is effectively creating an environment in which those people, who have an appetite to demonstrate best practice, but were previously unable to do so for various structural reasons, that the operations team are actually creating that environment that they can do that. That's incredibly valuable, both in terms of the performance of the team, but also in terms of like, how they're feeling about their ability to be effective in the role and their consequent, like how they feel about the role as a whole.
I think there's nuance in what you've just said there, because you're absolutely spot on, right? Or that, if I was charged in a business to say, Graham, it's your responsibility to go and whip these teams into shape, I'll be like, hang on a second, there's some big red flags here. But in partnership with those product leaders, with those directors, with the CPO, VP of products, whoever, to say, hey, look, we want to improve upon this. From my perspective as that product leader, I'm going to be outlining what I want to see, the resources that we have available, the best practice that I want to see, emulating it and showing some of that best practice as well. And what I need from you, Graham, in product ops is make sure that we've got the right tools, the right facilities, the right cadences, the right reminders, the right meetings going on, all the logistical part of this. And this is a piece. I mean, if you watch any of our podcasts, I keep talking about logistical side of things. Product ops I always think of as this very logistical partner to kind of say, look, this is what you want to roll out. Okay, that's great. And we've got that support. And we can absolutely talk about, a piece that you mentioned earlier, what does product ops need from leadership to be successful, and come on to that. One of those big things is the support of this, the drive, the almost an amount of autonomy to kind of go, Graham, look, go after this, go and get, push this out. You've got huge amount of freedom to explore what we need to explore here to get these teams going well. Handing it over completely, no. Big problem there. But working in partnership as that logistical partner to help roll these things out and do the kind of the complex planning, the deep thinking of how we're physically going to do this, do the working out behind the scenes, and ultimately letting the product leaders lead, letting those product leaders do what we need them to do, which as much as anything is core line management, core personal development and things like that. And then letting product ops just work along on the side, all the bits and pieces that would traditionally fall out. That's the key nuance there, is that partnership of doing something like that. And it works exactly the same across anything that Product Ops ends up doing.
That's interesting because, and I apologize if this is a question you've answered 100 times before, but one of the things, I think the risks is that product ops people are seen fundamentally as tools and process people. And, if you sort of take a step back, Ken Norton wrote this great article a few years back called "The Tools Don't Matter," right? Whereas he's basically advocating for people to stop spending so much time worrying about whether they're using the right tool, because great tools don't make bad PMs good PMs. Similarly, great PMs can cope with bad tools or good tools. Similarly, Marty Kagan has an article where he kind of decries the rise of what he calls process people, right? So you have these two very strong voices in the community who are advocating that tools don't matter that much and you shouldn't overinvest in processes. So how do you shape a richer understanding of what product is and kind of help people embrace the idea without feeling like, actually, this is really just, a lot of tinkering with tools and bureaucracy?
Yeah, I love that. And I think it does come up, I think, fairly often in my conversation with folks who haven't had much exposure to product ops. And honestly, bad product operations absolutely exists, right? There are absolutely people out there who really do have a product ops title and who are doing process for process sake. And we also have to acknowledge that that is in part sometimes true. But I think what I keep coming back to is, as a product ops leader, when I change something, introduce something new, remove something, am I doing it because it will help our product organization build better products? Like that is your guiding light. It's not standardization. It's not because all teams must work the same way because I said so. Right? Like our guiding light at the end of the day has to be, will this help us build better products? And anything beyond that scope, right? That is being a process person, right? That is standardization because it's comfortable for somebody else, usually way higher up the food chain, right? That just wants to have everything be very neat and very predictable, even though product work is incredibly unpredictable, actually. So it's really more about how do we design for that unpredictability or that flexibility, or for figuring out what doesn't work early and cheaply, right? While helping us make better decisions. And I think if we lose sight of that, yes, it is incredibly easy in this kind of role to be very, very busy, right? Advocate for all of the fanciest, all of the best, all of the newest tools, try and implement all of the different frameworks from all of the different books, and then just have a mess. That is just slowing everybody down.
Yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned slowing things down because I spend in my current role, particularly where we're looking, for the most part, I'm working with earlier stage businesses that do not necessarily have especially mature product processes. They may have relatively new product teams. They may not even have a product team in some cases, or if they do, they may not be that senior. And there is as you can imagine, it's pretty common that founders, particularly when I'm speaking to them, they say to me, my teams just seem to be slowing down, right? I just don't feel like I'm seeing the velocity that I would like. And some of this comes back to the fact that when it's 4 people sat around a table, you can move very quickly. And there's just a communication overhead that comes with scale. There's also the fact that once you have product market fit, you can't just try everything anymore. You're not trying to find a solution. You're trying to scale the solution. So there are lots of reasons for this. And I've got an article I wrote for the Boulderton blog in partnership with my engineering counterpart around all the different ways in which leaders can unlock more velocity amongst their teams, largely by enabling them to make decisions faster. But I would imagine that sometimes when you're approached, or other product ops leaders are approached by companies interested in deploying a product ops function, it comes from a similar sense of frustration about the overall productivity of the team, but often coupled, I imagine, and tell me if I'm wrong, with a lack of real thesis as to why that is. So they're just looking for someone who can come in and tell them, why is this not working? So when you're sort of when you're considering roles or opportunities to support businesses, what are you looking for in terms of how do you tell if this is an organization in which you can add value, and whether actually the dysfunction that has driven that conversation is real, or just rooted in unrealistic expectations?
Antonio, I'll let you go first because you're the
No,
consultant.
you go for it.
This comes very much back to that same piece we touched upon, which for me is always what support and what real deep down desire does leadership have to change. If it is very surface level, or if this is looking for someone else to kind of push ultimately the blame onto, or it's their problem, well, that's a huge red flag. If as a business leader or a product leader, you are looking at this and saying, yes, I absolutely do want to improve and we need to change. And hopefully by that point as well, you've also got some support from within your team as well to say, yes, look, we recognize that there is things we could be doing better. Then that is an important step forward. There is nothing harder in this job, and I don't think I've spoken to any product ops person ever that would disagree with this. There is nothing more difficult than trying to do this role when you don't have that backing from leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I have done it in two different roles now, whereby it's kind of, well, you're going to go and fix all of this, but I can't ask product teams to do anything different. Surely there's something you can be doing around the edges that just solves this problem and we can keep them happy at the same time. This is fundamentally change management. This is about looking at how we improve a business from the inside out. And sometimes that is painful. Not we try to make it as limit that pain as much as possible, but there is change. And some people, find that very painful to deal with. And unfortunately, that's just a business reality. For me, if I'm looking at a role or something like that, that's for me. I want to really get a good sense of what desire there is to truly make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. I would definitely second that. I think that's a very, very big one. I think for me, it's very interesting to hear how the person making the request is framing it, right? Whether they have a very, very defined idea of, oh, we just need to XYZ. We just need to get better at planning. We just need to get our developers to spend more time with customers. And I think that's a good starting point for a kind of discovery or investigation. But in my experience, a lot of the time, this is an incredibly interconnected system of humans.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the larger the organization, the more complex and the more changing something in this little node will do something in that little node that you hadn't foreseen. So I think to me, yes, that willingness to a certain extent give product ops folks the freedom to have those leadership level conversations, right? To be able to go back to the CPO and say, I've spent, 2 weeks kind of listening, observing, talking to people, and here are the 2 top things I believe are holding you back. And to be able to receive that feedback, right, from someone looking at your organization. And I think the second one is really an openness to discover solutions, as opposed to having maybe a fixed mindset as to what that we just need to actually looks like.
Yeah.
I think there's one additional thing that, and it comes back to something you were saying earlier, Tor, about kind of when you're talking about kind of being process people, being about kind of tools and things like that. Something I've kind of discovered kind of as well is there is a genuine, I feel there is sometimes a genuine need for some amount of process, some amount of step-by-step, some amount of standardization in place where there's upskilling needed in the product managers, in product teams, in whoever we're working with ultimately. It's not to say that, that's the way to train people is, well, you go step by step by step. But the opposite of that is to say, well, actually, we've got varying different levels and skills and experiences of our product teams in place. And so let's not have any process of those and let's just let them all continue. How otherwise do we kind of upskill them to a level and also identify and understand what that level fundamentally is? Process is a very, very big word. It's a very expansive word. And so process is not just like, well, do this checklist of this and this and this and this and you'll follow it every time. A part of this is understanding, what is our capability? What is our competency? A piece that we've just done at Helios over the kind of past 3 or 4 months is outline our own capability maturity framework and also a competency matrix for all of our for all of our PMs to understand what it is that we expect of them at different levels, and we expect them to be doing to achieve a good maturity in every aspect of what they're doing. So this is still something that Product Ops is heavily involved in, is mapping out what this looks like, and ultimately then saying, what do we do with that to help everybody upskill so that everybody can be truly an excellent PM. And I hate using that terminology because I don't like that, but ultimately upskilling them to a certain level from where they are now, without any sort of framework or anything else like that with this. I know it's very kind of extreme, but saying, well, just let them all get on with it. Well, then how do they improve? How do we get better, other than, well, get rid of them and get better, get better people in, there has to be processes and step-by-steps to achieve that.
Yeah. And I would, just to be clear, I would argue the process is not intrinsically bad, right? The wrong processes are bad, too much processes are bad, but also too little process is also bad. And I think, Marty's point is more about the risk of hiring people specifically to manage processes and creating, therefore, incentives for them to add process, because that is the way in which their performance is measured and the way in which they're rewarded, right? So if you have someone whose job it is to introduce process, they're going to introduce process, whether that process is needed or not. But something I think about a lot when I'm thinking about what processes are needed and how much process is needed is, to whom will the benefit of this process accrue, and to whom will the cost of this process accrue? And if those are different people, it's very difficult to roll that process out effectively, right? So if you have one part of people who are just effectively suffering at the mercy of the process, so that another set of people benefit from it. And that happens surprisingly often, right? And one of the classic examples of that is, we need better reporting so that the leadership understands in more detail what work is being done. And, that can feed into headcount planning and finance models for the coming year and stuff like that. And so you end up layering layers of reporting, on top of the ICs in the organization, purely for the benefit of the leadership, rather than a process which is actually, for example, designed to make planning easier, or make cross-functional collaboration easier, because people are able to, because they create like shared interfaces effectively between teams, right? So I've seen some processes work well where they say, actually, what this process does is it defines effectively the API by which one team engages with another team, and they share a common API, so they know what the expectations are, but they still are allowed within the team to implement that however they like, as long as the surface that they present to the rest of the organization is the same. So that is an example of something where there's clear benefit to both parties, and there tends to be less resistance there because people feel like it's making them more productive rather than just consuming time in work about.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier, right? So this kind of time pre Thorsten and post Thorsten. And as a leader, I'd be so interested in hearing how having somebody dedicated to product ops actually changed your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh no, it didn't change my work. It changed my life.
There we go. There's the soundbite for this episode. Done.
I mean, there's some truth in that, right? Because obviously Miro was a fun and exciting environment, but it was quite intense. There was a lot going on, and my kind of stack in my head was quite large. And so to have someone come along and know that I could partner with this person and they could take some of the stuff off that stack and allow me to spend less time on activities that I felt were valuable, but not necessarily activities that were the optimal use of my time, because they were not necessarily activities that only I could do, right? There were certain things which only I could do. And I don't say that arrogantly, but there are certain roles and responsibilities I had in terms of the strategy and the development of my team and the engagement cross-functioning at the leadership level. That squarely fell on my plate. And then there was a bunch of stuff I was doing that was really important to team cohesion, team morale, team productivity, but someone else could do that as well as I could, if not better, and probably almost certainly better because they would have more time to do it. Whereas I was trying to squeeze it in between all these other things. And one of the challenges I had when Torsten arrived, and I remember having this conversation with him, and I said, look, I've never worked with a product ops person before. I know conceptually what it is because I've seen the rise of the function. I've watched the podcasts, I've listened to I've read the articles, but I've never had that firsthand experience. And consequently, I need you to train me and coach me on how to effectively use you or utilize you for the benefit of the larger organization. And that's not just about telling me what you can do. It's also about telling me what you shouldn't be doing, right? Because what I didn't want to happen, and I was very conscious there was a risk of, is because we were so closely partnered, right? That was sort of, we were working together very closely on like, how do we drive the productivity of this stream? What I didn't want to happen is that I unintentionally start treating Torsten like my executive assistant, right? In the sense that like he, because he's awesome, was always trying to find ways to relieve the pressure on me because he could see that I had a lot on my plate. And so he would volunteer to take stuff off my plate. But like, there were some things I'm like, I don't think that's your job, right? I don't think that's fair of me to ask you to do that, right? Because that's not what Product Ops is about. And so we had to sort of kind of reach an understanding between the two of us as to what makes sense for me to delegate, or him, in some cases, for him to actually say, look, I think we need to do this, and I'm going to go do it. This is just an FYI, because I wasn't his manager, right? That's nice. I'm not in charge of him, right? So what it makes sense for him to do, what he needs to do for his own productivity and personal development, what it makes sense for me to retain, right, and what it makes sense for us to share or work on together. And a lot of the things that I ended up, or Torsten ended up helping with enormously, were kind of not processes, but like rituals that helped bring the team together, especially, a team that was, had come out of a period where everybody was working from home because of the pandemic. We'd moved into a new office. Bear in mind that Miro had about, 30 to 40 people in Amsterdam when they left the office at the beginning of the pandemic, and they had 700 people in Amsterdam when we came back to the office. Right. So we did not come back to the office. We came into an entirely new environment at a scale none of us had operated in before within that business. So you're trying to kind of create a sense of community within the stream, and you're trying to drive awareness of what other teams are doing and create a sense of shared mission and values. And that was something that's very important to me from a cultural perspective. It's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of work to build those rituals, to create those communication channels, to model those behaviors, right? To give people those opportunities to connect with the leadership, but also to share what they're doing with the rest of the team. And also kind of the social element of it as well. And it was the kind of work that it was easy to put off because there was some other crisis happening that day. But if you did that too long or in the long term, it was kind of catastrophic for your team. So this was something that played on my mind a lot, that there was more we could be doing to drive team, sort of the coherence of the team, and make people feel like they were part of something. But I had limited bandwidth to do that kind of work. So that was one element, was just basically Torsten said, I will take that. I'm just going to run with that. And obviously we still, talked about what the kind of strategy was there. But there's a huge gap between these are the kinds of things that I think the team needs in order to feel valued and feel part of the team, and actually making that happen. And then there was obviously perhaps the slightly more conventional stuff of like, well, how are we doing around just basic stuff around planning, around communicating strategy, around preparing for major launches, preparing for major product reviews, and so on. And we actually built out a cadence where we would essentially revisit and revise the strategy for the stream on a 6-monthly basis and bring that back to the leadership. And I think we were consistently the only stream to do that with a strong regular cadence over the course of several years. Like every 6 months, like we would come back and say, this is the revised strategy. And it wasn't like dramatically rewritten, right? Often it was refined, but it factored in whatever changes had happened in the larger macroeconomic environment and the competitive environment and so on. It factored in how the team had changed and evolved and grown, how the priorities of the business had changed. And repetition doesn't diminish the prayer, as Eric Schmidt used to say when we were at Google. So I think it's good to reinforce that every so often on a clear cadence. And so again, Torsten was hugely valuable in just helping us establish that as a cadence for the whole organization. So we knew like when we were going to do that, we set aside the time we needed to do that well in advance. So because the first couple of times it was kind of chaotic and we were still scrabbling to pull it together at the last minute, and we didn't have the level of thinking that we needed to do it well. So we got challenged in those reviews with questions we really should have had answers to and didn't. By the end, it was very mature, not a process, but an approach to how we built this strategy out and how we really decoded what we felt needed to be done. And the result was just much higher quality. It was easier to understand. It was much more focused and disciplined. It was better backed by strong data and research. And I learned a lot in that over those few years about how to do that well. And so in a sense, Torsten was not only facilitating that, but also holding me accountable to actually focusing on it at the right time and doing it properly. And also pulling in all the other people that we needed to do that well, making sure that we were offering opportunities for people on the team to be more visible to leadership by talking about their part of that, and that they were as well prepared as I was and everybody else was. And so there was, let's say, that was another big piece. Is just like our 6 and 12 monthly cadence became a lot clearer and cleaner and more consistent and predictable. And obviously there was like the planning processes. I don't think we did that radically different, but like management of the way we did OKR planning and the way we reconciled dependencies across teams and things like that. That was super helpful as well. But what was really interesting to me was, and I guess this is very normal, was how the first year, I would say, that we were working together, largely as Torsten was onboarding and then understanding the team, the strategy, what our role was in the business, how I worked, I was sort of driving those conversations about what the organization needed. And then after about a year, it got to the point where Torsten was like, no, I know what the organization needs. Like, I see it firsthand. You don't have to tell me. I need to tell you. And so like he was coming to me and saying, I think we should do this. I think we should do this. I think this would work. And we just ideate together on opportunities to drive, better performance out of the organization. And it was, again, I think it's really important that he didn't report to me. So he could come to me and point out things that were broken, things where I wasn't spending enough time, things where I wasn't, responding, as effectively as I could. And we built up enough trust by that point that hopefully he felt like he could challenge me, knowing that I would take that feedback, as a gift, appreciate it. And so I say it was a very, it didn't happen overnight, but it was a very, very different way of working, a year after he joined compared to a year before.
I love that. What an amazing example, I think, of the partnership between product leadership and product operations. And it's so interesting because, and I see this often in product leaders in scale ups or places that have rapidly scaled. Maybe the founder becomes the CPO, right? Where they go, but this stuff is my responsibility, right? I need to do all of these things because I'm the product leader, right? And I always tell them it's your responsibility to see that they get done, right? But it's not your responsibility to do all of those things. Like exactly like you said, right? Product leaders have unique skills, capabilities, context, experience that make them the best person for the highest level strategic tasks, right? And that is fundamental to the great operation of any product team. People need context, they need direction, they need to know where to go. But you cannot get these tactical operational topics to distract you, right, from the things that you yourself are uniquely positioned to do.
Yeah. And I think every leader goes through this maturing process where that early on in their career as a leader, so when they've recently moved into leadership roles, there's always a certain level of imposter syndrome. And there's a sense of like, I need to prove my worth, right? I need to demonstrate that I deserve to have this position now. And so there's a tendency to accrue sort of responsibilities, and you feel like you're helping the team by not overburdening them with other things, and they can just focus on the product delivery piece or whatever it is. But then you reach a point, and I certainly had this experience, where you suddenly realize, I can't cope with this. This is intolerable. There's just too much right here. And you start to realize, no, actually, the art of leadership is very largely about the art of delegating effectively. And once you realize that, and you reach the point where you're confident enough in your ability to do the role and add value to the business that you don't feel the need to do everything. And you also recognize that there will always be enough for you to do. You're never going to find yourself sat in a corner twiddling your thumbs, right? It's never going to happen. Then your mind set shifts completely the opposite way, to the point where I'm just like, I need to delegate as much as I can. Like every single thing I think I'm doing, I just stop and ask myself, why am I doing this? Right? Is this something that actually only I can do? Because if it's not, why isn't someone else? Why haven't I delegated this already? Right? Every single thing, it's like, I'm just trying to offload work. And in most cases, that work that you were so scared to delegate because you felt like you would burden someone or it would reduce your perceived value, actually giving that work to someone else is actually giving them an opportunity right? An opportunity to do something more strategic, to do something more interesting, to develop their own leadership skills, to increase their visibility within the organization. So in many cases, they'll really appreciate that, right? That's creating development opportunities for them. And so you've got this sort of great aligned incentives where I'm just trying to get rid of work and they're like keen to take it off me. Like, why wouldn't you take advantage of that as much as you can? But you need a certain level of confidence and maturity in your role to be comfortable doing that, knowing that you still have a lot of value to give. And actually doing this will unlock more time for you to actually demonstrate that value.
Fitness. This is a fundamental piece about product operations that I think gets overlooked far too often. That product ops is not there to just help the people on the ground, the ICs, the masses, in how they're working to get more and more out of them. It's firstly as much to support leadership, product leadership, tech leadership, actually leadership of the whole business to some degree in what they're doing. Exactly, absolutely, as you have described. There are skills and there are responsibilities that only you as the product leader can do. Deal with the board, deal with the C-suite, evangelize the product, line management that you contractually have to do anyway. And that's a full-time job most of the time in itself. And it's not, I think far too many people, and I think it comes down to that psychological safety as you suggested, and that confidence, sometimes look at product ops and kind of go, well, am I admitting defeat? Am I admitting to myself and the people around me that actually I've got too much to do? I can't do it all. Yes. Years ago, when I was doing product management, the product ops really wasn't a thing back then. So we were doing it all. But there is such an increase in demand to do more and be wider spread, particularly in product and tech leadership, that is just not physically possible. And so product ops absolutely is there to support, but again, particularly in that logistical sense about how are we going to roll something out. You set the guidelines, you set the strategy of a particular enhancement that we want to make in terms of how we're working, and then go, hey, Graham, Antonia, right, now how are we going to physically go and deliver this? How are we going to go and roll this out? Actually work on rolling this out with some of our teams. You touched upon a really interesting piece as well about, talking about Torsten, hi Torsten, if you're watching, you're being talked about a lot today, about being elements of an EA, and it's a difficult one because I think it's a very, very fine line. An EA or a chief of staff type role also commonly comes up. I personally don't think it's a bad thing if there are small elements of it. Yes, of course, if you are drafting emails for your leader and things like that, that's obviously far too much.
Mm-hmm.
But this whole kind of how do we solve a problem? How do we get around something? How do we just take something off your hands so that you can get focused on those things that only you can do? I don't fundamentally find a big problem in that where there is moderation. I think that's a partnership. And this is why product operations is absolutely a strategic role within the business. It's not absolutely a low level or a supporting role or anything else like that. It is very strategic. It's very much working alongside you, alongside your direct reports, particularly if you've got directors and VPs under you, working alongside them and saying, do you operate as much as the people on the ground, the ICs?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the sort of the EA risk, as it were, I think one way to think about that was definitely on my mind at the time was, okay, you could make a case that, as I say, taking work off of the shoulders of the leadership in order to give them more time to focus on the things that really matter and that they're uniquely positioned to do is adding value. At the same time, I do a lot of thinking, a lot of speaking around the topic of performance management for product people, right? So how do you build competency frameworks? How do you run performance management processes effectively? How do you treat people fairly, et cetera, et cetera? So I think a lot about the incentives that you create because that drives behaviors and the ways in which these systems don't always incentivize the right behaviors. So the question I ask myself is the work that my product ops person doing work that they will get credit for, right? That actually will be recognized as valuable to the business. Because if they're just acting as my EA, it's going to be really, really hard for them to make a case that they deserve to be promoted next time, right? So it's like, how do you ensure that they have opportunities to excel in their role, and that the work that you're co-creating together is something that they can put on their self-review and say, I did this and I did this and this, and the business will go, that is really, really valuable and that's important. But just coming back to what you said a moment ago, Antonia, around the importance of supporting leadership as well as ICs, or it might have been you, Graham, sorry, is I don't think that's just the right thing to do. I think that's existentially important to the existence of the role in the business, right? So one of the risks I see for product ops people is if they focus exclusively on the needs of ICs, they will not necessarily survive the next round of layoffs, right? Because they, sorry to be blunt, but like they just won't get the recognition of value that from the leadership that they need to do that. And the way you solve that problem is by being very, very valuable to the leaders, by being very, very valuable to the people who are making those decisions, not obviously to the exclusion of the ICs, but I think striking that balance is incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think this is such an important point, and this is really what separates this very tactical product ops as a PM assistant role from this strategic leverage role, which is what I often talk about, right? Because you can fill up your plate to the brim with quick fixes or things that somebody else at some point complained about, things that are small cumulative friction points. And individually, they're all things that ought to be solved one way or another. Like individually, they're all a little bit crappy and somebody justifiably is angry about them. But that's not what's going to move the needle. Because what ends up happening is you have a ton of sort of quick fixes delivered and you're not meaningfully changing the organization, right? You are not meaningfully progressing. But again, it's almost a catch-22 because you need to be in an organization that allows you to work on those big ticket items. And a lot of the time, that requires leadership involvement, right? That requires that partnership, that being able to say, let's put our heads together and let's rethink what is required of our planning cycle, right? To become more successful as a product team in the future.
But I don't
There's
think
an interesting analogy here that may be worth mentioning, which is in some ways you can think of the product ops person, and apologies, this is a tired analogy that you've heard before, but the product ops person as a PM of the product team, right? So, and if you think of like how we as PMs do planning, we can just listen to what our customers are complaining about, and only that, and we will end up delivering only incremental features that don't significantly move the strategy forward. They will fix a load of little pain points, right? And they will make the product marginally better, but they won't make big leaps. So part of the challenge is finding the balance between the short-term customer responsive needs and the long-term strategic vision and innovation of the business. This is very similar, right? Yes, there are certain sharp edges. It would be really great for you to help fix, but if all you do is sharp edges, you don't end up with anything that's like materially better, like significantly better than you had before. So you need that strategic vision to say, actually, there's a better way we can do this, or there's a different approach we can take to how this team operates that nobody is asking for, but the business needs, right? And so that we can drive.
I think the one piece that ends up being a little overlooked as well is how product ops very often is or should be that strategic advisor as well, that trusted advisor to leadership. And what that means as well is that there's that almost very, very mild or even subconscious influence when those kind of big decisions are being made. It can be on the product that we're building, but certainly as we're looking at kind of how teams are made up, how teams are operating, how product is fitting into the wider business, it's having someone that has a slightly different mindset, a slightly different thinking, somebody that's thinking that's going to be quite tough to roll out because actually it sounds like a great idea. But you know what? To do this successfully, and one of the things that I've always found is communication. Rolling out more enhanced ways of communicating across a business sounds super simple, but embedding that in teams so that they do it time and time again without thinking about it takes a long time to do. It's not difficult, it just takes a long time to embed. And so when you're having these sorts of conversations as a leadership team, product operations will be there and just to nudge them in a certain direction. They may not end up having any change or impact that you can point a finger to, but the change has been very, very subtle as that influence has been very subtle to just nudge in the right direction, to have people think about it in a certain way. And this is another reason why product ops can quite often be just slightly difficult to pin down, because that is happening consistently. Every conversation product ops is having comes at it with a different mindset to where most of the other product teams are doing. They're all thinking about customers and competitors and research and what we're delivering and capacity and what the engineers are working on and what does the CEO want to see. And product ops, as much as they are taking all that into consideration, is also thinking about but how is everybody going to react? How are my product managers going to react if we want to suddenly do this in this way rather than this way? And how would I go about rolling this out? And let's influence some of those, potential quick fixes that we know are not quick fixes that leadership wants to do. How do we influence that to go in the right direction? And I think that's often, again, an overlooked importance, and another reason why product ops ends up being at that very strategic level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, just suddenly noticed the time, and we are certainly at time. So, Tor, thank you so much for
My pleasure.
interesting conversation. I really enjoyed personally doing it this way round this time. It was absolutely fantastic. Antonia, I don't know what you felt.
That's fantastic. I learned so much from you, Thor. I think we could easily have another 2 hours and just keep this party going. It's
Absolutely.
very, very interesting, I think, for anybody in product ops to hear from leaders who have been there, who have worked with us, right? To say, this is what really worked, this is what was really valuable, and this is also the risks we see, right? Because I think it helps us so much on focusing on the right things and getting better at our craft, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely loved your account of the time that you went through Miro and bringing Torsten on board and working there and everything that you learned from that as well. So, Tor, thank you so much to our special guest today, Tor Mitchell, for everything that you have shared and allowed us to share in this very special episode as well. Please do connect with any of us on LinkedIn to our audience. If you are in and around the Oxford area where Tor is managing or co-creating the product tank sessions. I did one a few months ago, which was absolutely fantastic. I know you've got many more coming up. Have you got anybody interesting coming up over the next few sessions?
We just had one a few days ago. We had Nadine Matthews, who's a PM at the UK Hydrographic Office, and Mark Abraham, who's a well-known author, speaker, and fractional CPO. Our next event is in January of 2026, January the 28th, I think it is. But we have not shared the speaker list yet, so watch this space.
Oh, there we go. All secret. So yeah, do please check that out as well. Thank you to everybody for watching. We are out of time today. Antonia and I look forward to welcoming you on the next episode of the Product Opscast. Thank you, everybody.